This BOF Live is brought to you in partnership with Huge, a growth acceleration company that partners with the world's most ambitious brands to transform user experiences, harness technologies to maximize return on value, and innovate on their business models to drive loyalty and growth. Learn more at hugeinc.com.
Good morning, good afternoon. Hi, everybody. My name is Alice Gividen. I'm the Senior Content Strategist here at the Business of Fashion. Welcome to today's BOF Live. It's great to see so many of you joining already. Please use the chat function to say hi, to connect with each other, and let us know where you're tuning in from. Today, we're going to explore the marketplace model and all the exciting innovation that we're seeing in this space. Pre-pandemic, as I'm sure you all know, this was already an area of considerable growth and success. But the pandemic, as with many things in our industry, was a catalyst for acceleration. It's reported by a range of sources who have pieced together data that marketplaces made up more than 60% of global e-commerce spend today. And we can attribute this to major innovation within the model. We're seeing advancements in retail media networks. We're seeing much more powerful and compelling storytelling capabilities. And we're also seeing operational efficiencies that are providing everything from great service and great logistics to even natural gateways into the metaverse. And all of these things are driving growth in this space. So to really identify how all these innovations are transforming user experiences and presenting a lot of new opportunity, I'm delighted to be joined by two amazing experts in this space. Holden Bale is the Group Vice President and the Head of Commerce at agency Huge. Holden, it's such a pleasure to have you with us. Hi.
Hey, Alice, thank you for having me.
Thank you. Huge works with companies as varied as LVMH and Kering, to McDonald's and Spotify on everything from experience design to physical retail to bespoke commerce strategies. And actually, its recent Future of Marketplaces report really examines and debunks the marketplace landscape. And we're joined today as well by Steve Dool, who is brand director at peer-to-peer marketplace Depop. Steve, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Steve, in its latest figures, Depop reported it had over 30 million users across 150 countries, with 90% of its active users under the age of 26. So really providing a real snapshot of how this Gen Z customer is engaging with marketplaces. So very excited to be unpacking some of your learnings from Depop. But before we get started, just for everyone watching, a small bit of housekeeping. If you'd like to ask us a question, please click the Q&A button in your toolbar to send these straight through, and we'll do our best to make some time for them. Please use that button rather than the chat, as often they'll get a bit lost in there. And finally, if you need any help at all, our customer support team is available via the chat as BOF events. So to kick things off, I'd love to give everyone a bit of an overview of the growth in this space. Holden, I know Huge has done vast amounts of work and research on this. When it comes to innovation, to commerce models, we've seen the rise of D2C, but then the rise of brand accelerators, then the rise, then the fall, then the rise again of wholesale. So among all of that confusion, I suppose, how has the marketplace landscape evolved over the last few years?
One of the reasons I work in retail is it's not boring. So it's definitely delivered on not being boring the last few years. I think two things have happened with respect to digital commerce in particular over the last 3 years. First, most of the global players, what we call marketplace giants in our research, who do billions or in some cases hundreds of billions of dollars in GMV, they appear to have reached a point of saturation in their respective markets. Mercado Libre at around 25% in Latin America, Amazon and Alibaba both having around 40% of US and Chinese e-commerce respectively, Otto in Germany, Rakuten and Amazon basically splitting down the middle in Japan. That doesn't mean revenue isn't growing because e-commerce spend is growing something like 12 to 18% depending on the market, but they're not acquiring new customers the way they were in the past. Secondly, e-commerce customer experience as a whole, and I'm sure many of the folks who are on the chat and watching this know this space quite well, it's generally improved. both multi-brand retailers and brands with their own digital D2C presence have finally turned a corner in their digital capabilities, and in some cases, their omni-channel maturity. And so what happens in any market that's relatively mature, where there's a great deal of competition, is innovation and customer experience and novel forms of monetization. And I think on the flip side, and sort of teeing up Steve a little bit, traditional wholesale retailers are starting to embrace marketplace business models for multiple reasons. And there are now these innovators in the space, such as Network, who are playing with really kind of content-rich experiences and time-limit exclusivity. There's LTK, who are doing almost an interesting kind of triple-sided marketplace model with influencers driving the merchandising and curation. And then there's Depop, who's so deep in Gen Z. And I know Steve will talk about their business. All of these platforms, to me and to the clients we serve, are really reframing what we think of as a marketplace.
Absolutely. Thank you for teeing up, Steve, because you're doing my job for me ultimately. But that consumer piece, that is particularly interesting, particularly around Gen Z. Steve, I mentioned earlier that 90% of Depop's active users are classified as Gen Z, are under 26. And I'm sure that's really only one part of the story. What shifts in consumer shopping behavior has Depop been tracking? And how do they really relate to not only the marketplace model, but how it's defined your business?
Yeah, so we are a peer-to-peer, mobile-first social marketplace. So that's a lot of qualifiers and sort of intersections. So consumer behavior and consumer sentiment trends are super important to us. We track against any number of metrics that we're looking for. I think for us, we've seen a huge shift, which shouldn't come as news to anyone, in that sustainability is a mainstream concept. And sustainability is something that is a really strong motivator for people to join Depop. We're very clear when we talk about sustainability that we're really talking about circularity, but oftentimes as it's kind of explained word of mouth, peer-to-peer, it kind of gets grouped under that umbrella and under this idea that people want to shop from places and from people that are aligned with their values. Sustainability obviously being hugely important to young people everywhere. I think what is sort of conflicting with that a little bit is also for the industry at large and for fashion brands and retailers, becoming more sustainable also drives up price points in many ways for many brands, whether it's because of needing to pay living wages and fair wages to the people who are making it down the supply chain, or just because the cost of materials increases. So there is a disconnect in some ways that we've also been tracking, in that sustainability is important, but affordability is still paramount, and that does affect ultimate behaviors beyond intention. So I think what's important for us, and the way that this kind of consumer behavior affects what we do, is we have to kind of marry the broader landscape, the fashion and retail landscape, with also tracking the behavior and the sentiment of our own community who's already active on Depop. Because that will help us, I think, oftentimes problem solve for a lot of these things. So, for example, we know from surveys with the Depop community that 75% of them are buying on Depop and buying secondhand first, because it aligns with their values of wanting to be more sustainable in their choices and specifically extend the lifestyle of clothing when we're talking about secondhand pieces. We also know that 65% of our community say that price is the reason why they're on Depop as well. So that for us, marrying that with the broader consumer trends helps us with positioning, with marketing, with letting people know, what we're kind of all about. So it's important for us to keep an eye on both of those things. But I think in terms of the biggest, most radical shift we've seen, it's really that idea of sustainability going mainstream.
I like this idea of really listening to your customer and iterating, understanding that affordability and sustainability piece. And that's something we're going to touch on in more detail later on. But in that same vein, this idea of really kind of moving to meet the needs of your customer, I'd love to know what that looks like operationally. Holden just listed some amazing and hugely broad examples of marketplace models. But I'd love to hear from Depop what does a successful marketplace look like operationally? What are those key considerations to be making?
Yeah, we're a social marketplace, so fostering that sense of community is first and foremost on our mind for everything. We want to make sure that the social elements that we've had that have been there from the beginning, the ability to like sellers, to follow them, to chat with them even. All of that needs to be there. We need to foster those connections more in order to keep kind of our unique proposition in the marketplace. But I think broadly, for what makes marketplaces work most is personalization and ease of navigation. Because oftentimes marketplaces have a ton of inventory, as Depop does. So you want to make sure that it doesn't become cumbersome, and that there's an element of personalization there for us. So we have In terms of the ease of navigation, most of what any kind of fixes we make to the product come directly from feedback from our community. So we're addressing those needs. We're constantly optimizing search and kind of like surfacing, quality, interesting inventory. And in terms of the personalization piece, we rely a lot on, which I would recommend for any kind of marketplace, given the current landscape, is algorithm, but also a human touch and curation there. I think those two things, you can't just have one or the other. I think you really need both of them. So, just using specific examples, we have a section called My DNA, which is the first thing that appears on the app, which is based on interests you put in, brands you like, behavior in the app. And that's all great. And it's wonderful, and our community responds to it. But then we also have places where we can sort of react to trends in a more curated manner that has an editorial team and a merchandising team behind it, who are able to just sort of engage with some quality control to make sure the inventory is quality inventory that we're surfacing, and just give it a little bit of that touch that you just can't get without some kind of editorial and curation voice.
We're definitely going to talk about this later on, that curation piece within marketplace. Like, that is still so incredibly key. It's exciting to hear that it's still being innovated and being a big area of focus. Yeah. Holden, I'd love to come back to you just to sort of round out this overview before we dig into the topics we want to discuss. When you and I prepped for this conversation, when we caught up last week, you said to me that everything is about to become a marketplace. Can you share with us today what you mean by that and what innovation we can expect to see in this space?
Well, I think when we talk about marketplaces to our clients, and I think almost the report that we published, which we did months of research on, and you can get it from our website. There's our shameless plug. It's free, 30 pages. It's pretty, I promise. When we talked about marketplaces, and we said the word marketplace, depending on where somebody lived, they thought about like Amazon, they thought about Zalando, they thought about Otto, they thought about whatever. And what we've seen is this idea of the commerce convergence, where seemingly every digital platform is exploring a marketplace model. It almost feels like the entire internet is turning into marketplace. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, why social platforms and search platforms and media companies are doing that. But it's almost a question of like, what is in a marketplace? Roblox has creator tools and individuals for brands and individuals to develop virtual goods and sell them. Is that a marketplace? Kind of is a marketplace, right? In like some capacity. And so when we talk about innovation, I think it's great to hear Steve talk about customer experience. I actually think a lot about back-end infrastructure. One of the things I point to our marketplace is expanding into full service logistic companies to the point where they don't even care if you sell on the platform, like really kind of moving away from a marketplace. It makes sense because in many cases, giants have the most sophisticated supply chains in their respective regions. JD has what is more or less the most mature drone delivery network in the world for tier 2 and tier 3 cities in China. And so you look at Mercado Libre, you look at Rakuten, they have freight forwarding, they have warehousing and logistics, they have cross-border tax and regulatory services that help you expand into Japan or certain countries in Latin America without even having to register a formal business entity. And it's fine with them if you're selling through social or through a D2C presence. Along that line, I think there's been some hype. I don't know if it's right or wrong that Amazon is going to go to market and compete with UPS and FedEx directly. In some cases, and what I'm interested in seeing emerge, there's this concept of almost like business as a service offerings. Like basically, I will run your entire retail operations for you. And it's been very popular in Asia Pacific because it's enabled creators and designers to launch brands almost entirely on marketplace platforms with no supply chain and minimal product development. Shopify is kind of vertically integrating in terms of D2C, but they're not doing product development. And while Shopify itself isn't a marketplace, their discovery app absolutely is. That's another blurring of boundaries. So I'm very conscious that one thing we've yet to see in the West are the creation of brands that can do tens or hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue, but have no formal D2C website and minimal or no wholesale presence. They exist almost entirely inside of Depop, or they exist almost entirely inside of Instagram, or they exist almost entirely inside of Google, or whatever the case might be. And I'm curious to see if that emerges in the next couple of years.
Absolutely. That's really the perfect segue into our first real topic I'd love to dive into. And that's really around some of the access to opportunities that brands and consumers can experience through marketplaces, be that new routes to market for brands, new routes to customers, things like business as a service that Holden, you were just discussing. And actually, Holden, I think it would be great to start with you. You know, marketplaces by their very nature, since they've existed, have always provided entry points to new consumers or new demographics. But I'd love to know a little bit more about how that's evolved and what new access points you think that they can provide today.
Yeah, again, it sort of becomes like this world of it. I feel like I'm cheating because I'm just reframing your question. It's almost the inverse of the question. What access can you not gain through marketplaces? So, you know, you look at traditional sort of like digital advertising, search, product discovery, social communication. Google and Meta are both focusing on commerce because it diversifies their revenue, because advertising businesses are under a lot of scrutiny from antitrust and the way ad auctions works and from a privacy perspective. Social platforms like Snap and TikTok and Pinterest are focusing on commerce because we're seeing the traditional purchase funnel disappear. And the increasing consumer expectation that you can really transact at the point of inspiration, wherever that is. So if you're thinking about gearing yourself towards a more content-driven, sort of like serendipitous experience, something that's more brand first or more bi-directional engagement, you would say, okay, well, I want to start exploring commerce through a lens of these sort of like bi-directional social platforms like Snap or TikTok or Pinterest versus, no, I'm thinking about it from a discovery perspective, being up the funnel, what used to be the funnel, in terms of engaging with the Google or a Meta. I was surprised to see this. We saw a major milestone in the data that we track on a quarterly basis. 70% of North American consumers had said they had purchased at least once through social in our last quarterly research report. And that is a huge inflection point for us to see. It may only be one time, especially in certain older cohorts, but it's really an unlocking of something. You also see it in media, which may seem a little strange to people because we've been talking about buyable entertainment for probably 15 years. And honestly, it's been kind of a joke. Like the experience has been terrible. Technology hasn't really worked, but BuzzFeed has said commerce is a strategy pillar in their analyst calls, and they're testing a marketplace that basically takes their buying guides and makes them shoppable. So if you want to play with curation, if you want to play with editorial, do you look at a marketplace through that angle? YouTube is very close to native shoppability on their platform. And then there's the retailers, right? Nordstrom, who I used to work for, and I think is one of the great innovators in the department store space, they're moving to a model that's more concessions heavy at the same time as their digital presence is becoming more experiential. NMG, I think, has historically been reticent of marketplace models, but I'll bet Farfetch will change their mind, right? Macy's is starting a marketplace. Net-a-Porter is doing the same. Falabella in Latin America is really heavily invested in marketplace models as core to their business. So I think retailers are doing this not just because they want to avoid inventory liability, but because brands themselves have built digital D2C muscle and they want it. They want more control of their look and feel on the platform. They want control of inventory and pricing and promotionality. So again, it's sort of like what is true to your brand and who you want to be in the world and how you want to engage with consumers. And frankly, there's a marketplace for you out there, you know, to go find.
Yeah.
And you know, the other thing is that's interesting about sometimes that when brands want to work with Depop is because a lot of brands' e-commerce sites are built on sort of an outdated model, to be fair. They don't have the space on their e-commerce to put different types of inventory or inventory from past seasons or things like that they're still holding on to. So it opens up a lot of possibilities given the limitations of sort of like the last great revolution, you know, which was getting them all to get online in the first place.
And I think you see it a lot where, you know, with respect, I mean, there are, of course, the Nikes of the world. You know, there are the companies that can invest hundreds of $1 million in engineering and UX teams and design, the kind of stuff that like another plug Huge is good at. But it is really hard to match the pace of Amazon's R&D budget or Alibaba's Tmall R&D budget. And so we have companies come to us and say, should I do live streaming on my platform? And sort of the answer is like, well, I don't know. Why don't you try different content formats on Instagram or on Amazon or on Tmall and see how they do for you? Oh, we're trying bundling a certain way. Well, why don't you beta test it on a marketplace that already has that capability? And so I think people need to broaden kind of like the aperture of their thinking of marketplaces, not just as it's almost like a wholesale channel where I just sell things. Like, no, it's a place for experimentation. It's a place for learning. And if you sort of segregate it outside of your brand, not only are you going to have an incoherent consumer experience, you're not going to derive any of the value from it, you know?
When we're thinking about consumer experience, actually kind of harking back to what we were discussing earlier, Steve, you know, talking about being a marketplace, being a destination that aligns with the customer's values, offering the means to shop more sustainably even, to buy brands with smaller runs or operate with more purpose. Depop is inherently doing that. And we know that, for the fashion industry, achieving circularity is still a huge, huge pain point. Less than 1% of garments are recycled. There are so many more horrifying statistics I could throw at you, but we know them all. This is, I think, a real opportunity for brands. How could they be leveraging marketplaces like Depop to authentically achieve a more circular model?
Yeah, well, also, please do throw some awful statistics around, because I think the more we talk about them, the better it is. But I think, so circularity, like I mentioned earlier, that is what we've identified as the area for the biggest impact that we can have. And it's very important for us to also be, as I said, very transparent about what we mean when we talk about sustainability, which is why we tend to use the word circularity specifically, as opposed to this circularity term, which has gotten kind of greenwashed and nebulous, to oblivion. But for us, where we see our biggest impact as a marketplace is just making circularity, in our case, secondhand first, as the most desirable and accessible option to the biggest group of people possible. And so that's really what we're working with. And I think we also know, though, that to move beyond that kind of impact, we do need the cooperation and the collaboration with the industry at large, or else, we'll be fairly limited in that regard. So it's why we work with charity shops and bring them on board to be able to offload more merchandise and more inventory than they can possibly ever put on their shop floor based on the donations that many of them get. It's why we also work with fashion brands to bring them in ways that we're making sure that we're solving a problem for them, in addition to just bringing quality inventory into the app, and oftentimes working directly with our community to embrace that peer-to-peer, the peer-to-peer aspect of Depop, as opposed to trying to work around it as a brand to come in. And I think beyond that too, it's also empowering individual entrepreneurs. So, we've worked with Sojo, which is sort of, I think the way that it's been described is like the Deliveroo of clothing repair. Yeah. So, I mean, perfect. Those types of things, though, that we have the reach to on our own to help a smaller brand who has the potential to really make an impact from a circularity perspective. We also can leverage the reach of much bigger partners who are also genuinely invested in it as well. So I think for now, what we're really focusing on is just understanding, getting people to understand what circularity is, and then getting it out there as far as we can as a really attractive option, an alternative to just always buying new.
Yeah, absolutely. This idea of marketplaces being able to kind of problem solve and troubleshoot some of these really pertinent issues, I think, is really key. So to kind of stay on that, Holden, I'd like to turn to some of the kind of compelling new functionalities that we're seeing within marketplaces. And retail media networks are one of the 4 key drivers that Huge flags as really defining the future of marketplaces. And I'd love to hear from you about how this space has evolved beyond the things, the traditional retail media that we've seen, like display ads.
Yeah, well, we can be honest, because we're amongst friends here. Historically, retail media has been extremely boring. I mean, this is, you can buy a sponsored search result, you can buy space in a recommendations carousel. Maybe you can do something a little spicy. If a retail media network offers a homepage slot, or oh my God, space in a marketing or transactional email, right? And boring can grow very fast. I think, digital customer acquisition costs are out of control. The whole joke about digital CAC is the new rent. And now it's with experiential retail rent is the new CAC. Facebook is up to close to 40% year over year. I think Google is up over 10% and ROAS is down. TikTok is up something unbelievable, 70%. So from what we've seen, retail media was around an $80 billion market last year because of that presupposition that retail media is intrinsically lower funnel. The consumer's in a purchase mindset, and that the closer the consumer is to a purchase, the more valuable the impression. But if you look at where marketplaces are going in a couple of years, arguably now for some of them, especially some of the platforms in the Asia Pacific, they have advertising networks that are as robust as media companies, as Google and Meta. You already see insurance companies and banks advertising in Amazon search. I saw some crazy statistic the other day that their advertising business was the collected size of all of the revenue generated by all of the newspaper advertising in the world. You can sponsor platform events. You can advertise on boxes, on trucks, on billboards. Marvel's done box takeovers. M&M's has done it. You can be like Savage X Fenty and have virtual shopping events. You can buy into live stream formats. Tmall has entire advertising packages around Singles Day. Rakuten has one of the most sophisticated digital marketing networks in Japan that functions as a standalone business unit. And so in many ways, these marketplaces are marketing channels as much as they are commerce channels. We're launching an offering in the next couple of weeks called Commerce Channel Navigator, specifically because a lot of brands aren't ready to operate effectively in this world, and they're bifurcating marketing and e-commerce teams, or they're treating social different than marketplaces, even when social are moving into marketplace models, and their existing channel strategies just aren't fit for purpose. But I actually think it's an interesting example of some of the formats are there, and brands are not availing themselves of them. And I think it's because literally of the structure of businesses and how they perceive of marketplaces. So in 2 years, we think every single brand in North America and Western Europe, inside of their marketing plans, they're going to have a retail media line item to do more experiential things. And I think you're going to see the uptake in activations of more experiential marketing through marketplaces, especially over the next 24 months.
Do you think the onus there is also on the marketplaces to establish maybe more thoughtful partnerships, or to collaborate more closely with these brands to offer the infrastructure? You mentioned that there's still a reticence to try this new technology. What are the blockers?
I mean, I think some of the platforms have done a decent job in partnership. I think it really depends on the platforms. You know, like if you're LVMH and you go to and pitch for any marketplace, they're going to bend over backwards for you, and they're going to say they're going to give you a smoothie, they're going to give you a back massage, like whatever you want, you know. But if you're a brand and you're kind of mid-size, or you're just out there and you're exploring, I don't think that all of the marketplaces do a particularly good job of articulating what their advertising network looks like. But on the flip side, you kind of have to look at the way that digital advertising works in the world. A lot of companies they farm it out to a partner, they give them a budget. That partner is trying to figure out how to maximize execution of the budget. They're very focused on linear advertising or television, or the digital marketing they're doing is through Google or Meta. They don't actually hold back the funds to kind of do the experimental fun stuff that's on the edge. And if like you're an Amazon, you're looking for brands to partner with you on, and you want to do it. You might even do creative commercial terms for brands that are willing to try out new functionalities or new technologies. So I think to a certain extent, brands have to take control and reframe the strategy of how they think about marketplaces as an experiential channel as well as a commerce channel. I do think it starts with brands. I certainly think marketplaces can do a better job telling the holistic story, though, for sure.
No, thanks. That's great. Great advice for everybody watching. Steve, one interesting aspect of, a functional support, I suppose, around this marketplace piece is around logistics. The operational arms of so many global marketplaces now can power international expansion. They can help with same-day delivery around the world. They can get you closer to your customer in places you don't really have a presence. How important are these elements of service? And I'd love to know if you can tell me more about Depop making plays in this space.
Yeah, I mean, I think a smooth, kind of seamless user experience is one of the most important things for any kind of marketplace. It varies definitely depending on what your marketplace is in terms of how you achieve that. But I think broadly speaking, a lot of it is based around building trust with your consumer. For us, we're a peer-to-peer marketplace, so we don't handle any inventory, and we're not responsible for fulfillment of the orders. So what we see as our role is really just enriching that end-to-end experience. So we work a lot with the in-app experience. We keep all of the transactions and comms in-app, so that if a dispute does arise, we have a team who can sort of see the whole picture. We also have Depop payments that we can track payments and look at how those are going. So we're not the ones shipping things out, so we're not the ones who are responsible for how fast things go, other than giving our sellers all the information they need to be successful there, and also offering incentives to ship in the time that you say you will. Clearly, labeling on your shop when you'll ship. They're just those sorts of considerations. We spend a lot of time educating our community on how to make that happen. I think the other element of it is looking at where it goes just beyond what we think of as logistics. So, we've done a lot, for example, to become climate neutral in terms of carbon emissions from all of our sellers on the platform, not just from us and our operation as a business. Because again, that builds trust in the platform, it builds trust in the sellers. It just makes it a full, rich experience for people who are maybe not used to shopping in that model. I think a lot of that can expand to marketplaces that are not just peer-to-peer. It's a different way of shopping than many people are used to. They're used to going direct to either a traditional retailer or a brand. So you just want to make it as kind of smooth as possible based on whatever you're offering for your customer ultimately.
And to do that in 150 countries is particularly impressive. To be honest, I imagine that becomes very nuanced.
Well, we have, I was just saying, we have a customer support team that is among our biggest teams at the company for that reason, and they do a lot of tremendous work.
Amazing. For all of its virtues, so many huge benefits to the marketplace model. There was traditionally always one slight snag in the model itself, and that was really this idea that brands had little to almost no control over their visual identity and their brand narrative. It was a big part of the rise of D2C. You're really reclaiming your narrative and your aesthetics. And that Holden now, I think Huge has been reporting on this, and we've seen, new and older players alike, even Amazon, with its luxury arm, with its storefronts, are now promising to not only protect brand equity, but offer brands huge amounts of autonomy over their visual identity. What innovation are you tracking? How are marketplaces now allowing brands to control their own narrative?
So I would say it's getting better.
Yeah.
I would not say it's great, but better is something. Incremental change is better than no change. So if you look at Tmall Pavilion, I think in particular, they reshaped expectations for better or worse. And they almost like set a kind of a ceiling of what's capable, in particular for luxury brands. In some cases, I also think you can look to gaming platforms. And I know people kind of poo-poo that, but you think about the flexibility in terms of creator tools or creating own spaces inside of virtual worlds. And if you look at those two, you see the clearest examples of marketplace platforms giving brands complete discretion and autonomy. You can own the front end. You can functionally develop front end code that runs on top of the platform, almost like you can develop a MIDI program in WeChat. And Instagram or a Snap are also decent. I'm trying to reframe to think of them as marketplaces 2 or 3 years down the road, but you're still operating inside the box of what that platform allows. Mm-hmm. So Amazon's been toying with this. I think gradually their storefronts have gotten better in terms of degrees of freedom from customer experience. In general, marketplaces are almost always better than multi-brand retailer websites. A lot of the experience of marketplaces in Europe in particular is still very templated and constrained, and that's disappointing. But in the same way, brands want their unique experience to come through. If you're a Farfetch at the platform level, you don't want to disjoint a customer experience either. So this is one of the areas where I believe physical retail greatly outpaces digital and has for years. If you look at concessions, if you look at how Ulta Beauty is able to merchandise spaces inside of Target, how Nike merchandises inside of Nordstrom, there's a mature store and a store model in physical retail that has not translated to digital. So over the next 2 or 3 years, you're going to see it. It's going to come. You're going to see every couple of months new product updates, new tools for managing the front end, new formats for manning consumer chat, or having direct conversations or more data sharing. But I think most likely it'll be offered to luxury brands before anyone else as a way to incentivize those brands to come on platforms they've traditionally ignored.
I do also think to that point, there is something interesting that is changing the way the most forward-thinking brands are thinking about their brand. And that's like, you can't, I think the days when you can hold so tight that fitting into a marketplace isn't feasible are over. And I think there's too many platforms, there's too many places where a brand needs to show up that they can't be that adaptable. Obviously, every brand has things that they just won't do and they can't do. And that's a whole, that's a very valid way of thinking, but you're missing out on meeting your customers where they are if you're not able to sort of play within the constraints of different platforms that can, be really transformative for you.
Yeah, we talk a lot about sort of open versus closed source brands at Huge, and how the open source brands were more comfortable with community and culture and sort of like bi-directional engagement, which is a lot of what we're seeing through, things like Web3, which I know is like a big loaded term. Those brands are just intrinsically more fluid and intrinsically better to operate in all of these various different formats and settings. So, I see some of the questions in the chat, things like, we're seeing the capability for luxury brands to do owned ad formats, to run their own live streams on platforms. We're starting to see, in some cases, a few of the platforms allowing direct brand to customer interaction, not just through like service emails, but actually like being able to man chat or spinning off of Tmall and connecting through WeChat for one-on-one conversation. So like marketplaces are slowly inching towards it. Brands are slowly growing their digital sophistication and their willingness. And again, I think the point I would make is if every single digital platform 2 or 3 years from now, and if by 2027 all digital advertising is natively shoppable, everything is going to feel like a marketplace. And so you have a choice. You can be there or you cannot be there. I would highly advise you be there, but it's your decision.
I would too, Holden.
I'm glad we're on the same page.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that is the perfect segue. I'm glad, Holden, you just said Web3 was a loaded term. I'm about to throw loads of loaded terms into the conversation because we're on to, our third and final topic for today, where I'd really like to look at some of the future of marketplaces over the medium and over the long term, if we're being realistic, particularly in relation to virtual goods and to new nascent technologies, be that the metaverse, even if actualization is years away, or emerging Web3 technologies that we're seeing certainly begin to emerge, certainly front of mind for a lot of fashion players. Holden, at BOF, we've been tracking the rise of, and actually the utility, more importantly than anything else, of virtual products for a few years now. And one thing that is interesting is that the platforms for these virtual goods, be that DressX, be that the dematerialized, are emulating or borrowing from the marketplace model. What makes marketplaces a powerful partner for dealing with virtual goods, for entering a kind of metaverse, even if, as I say, we are years off, an actualized version?
Yeah, I mean, I think in any space of newness, you're trying to centralize demand and you're trying to centralize supply. So for the brands we work with, we tend to say virtual worlds, whether they have to do with Web3 technologies or not, and virtual goods, whether they have to do with Web3 technologies or not, whether they're on the blockchain or just virtual products and services. Well, in one case, it's actually already a pretty mature market. I thought it was very illuminating during the Epic Apple lawsuit. It came out in the testimony that Epic made over $5 billion in 2022 in Fortnite from transaction fees. Just from fees, the take rate. So in-game transactions, battle passes, skins, that kind of stuff. And you've seen some of the stuff that LV has done inside of Fortnite. It's shocking. But I think it's the kind of thing where you need to be intentional about developing a muscle now. Mm-hmm. And being able to partner with companies who are going to build the infrastructure is kind of the obvious play. Not everybody can pull a Nike and buy Artifact and basically do an acqui-hire to get all the skill set inside of their brand. And also there's kind of like something intrinsically about Web3 that is communal. It should be partnership based. It should involve co-creation. So we see the velocity of the adoption of these new technologies, or sort of what I would call like experience modalities. It's increasing every single generation. And the news that Apple was demoing an XR headset last week to their board of directors is already starting to move markets. So, you asked about innovation earlier that marketplaces are making. I think by 2027, this is part of our prediction, almost all of the marketplace giants, certainly, and a lot of the newer entrants like DressX, like OpenSea in some capacity, they'll probably offer metaverse enablement. They'll just tack it onto their existing business services. They have the infrastructure, they have the consumer base, they have the engineering talent to mint NFTs, to develop studios that do 3D visualizations of your product at scale, at cost, to develop consumer wallets, to develop the secondary markets for resale of the products. So right now, the primary vehicles for NFT acquisition, you mentioned it, they're marketplaces to begin with. I think it's not long before the traditional marketplaces themselves start to offer those services.
It's interesting to think of marketplaces as an entry point. We were talking about it earlier as this entry point to new consumers, new demographics, and now an entry point into this new technological space. And I like this idea of being open to this technology as well. It's something that was brought up in our tech summit by Jeff Carvalho from High Sobriety. He said, make no mistake, we are still in the very, very early nascent stages of this technology. So that sense of openness and experimentation, I think, is really important. Steve, we've mentioned Web3, but to go into it a little further, lately, tech disruptors are championing it as the internet's next phase, a decentralized and open era, really rectifying some of the imbalanced economics that we've seen within Web 2 and placing power kind of really back into the hands of users, of the individual creators. And obviously, we've said it a lot throughout this conversation, Depop is, a social first peer-to-peer marketplace. As such, it has a hugely engaged community and is quite ripe for this sort of space. How could that foundation, Depop's foundation, really lend itself to moving potentially into Web3 and some of those technologies that we're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few things that are really important to consider around this conversation, and we've already seen brands dip into this in certain to varying degrees of depth. But a lot of what, when we talk about it internally, what we talk about is the tech changes, but a lot of what people use it for doesn't. So people are ultimately, with what we've seen so far, they're looking for connection and community, and to a certain degree, in most cases, probably some kind of consumption as well, whether it's content or actually like a commercial transaction. Yeah. And so what that does for us is it kind of just underscores the need to really make sure that we are making community front and center for what we do. And I think that's true for a lot of marketplaces. Probably there's obviously a lot of questions around capability versus opportunity. So just because we have the tech to do something, does it make sense for us to do it? Does our community really want us to do that? Is it going to move the needle in any kind of meaningful way? I think those are all important questions to grapple with. I also think the sort of mindset that is behind a lot of these changes and what makes it exciting is almost in the short term, especially, kind of more important. So, something like you're talking about Web3 and all of its sort of decentralization elements. What does that mean for trends, for example, that deeply affects what we do on Depop? It means the monoculture, which has already sort of been blown to smithereens, is going to become even further blown to smithereens. And everyone has and will find a place where they can find their sub-communities and their subcultures and people who are inspiring them and sharing those ideas. So you better make sure that when they're finding that elsewhere, you still have that capacity in your company as it stands. So for me, that kind of stuff is really interesting. And I think a lot of what we're talking about right now, that is happening, whether or not we're making an NFT next week. Do you know what I mean?
Totally. I think that idea of community underscoring everything is the most critical, piece of this conversation. And I'd like to stay on that and come to you, Holden. Thinking about DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, for everyone watching, we have quite a lot of pieces on DAOs now on BOF across our content. I encourage you to go and sort of have your mind blown a little bit. But, these are certainly being positioned, certainly in the fashion industry, as a new way to community build, to even create democratically. At our tech summit again earlier this month back in New York, they were likened to a WhatsApp group with a shared bank account, which is my favorite description to date. That's just helped bring so much clarity. But what overlap, if any, could we see between DAOs and marketplaces as we know them today?
I just want to hook on something that Steve said, which I think is one of the reasons why I love fashion, because obviously we do a lot of work outside of fashion at Huge, but fashion lives and dies, yes, by quality, but also by cultural relevance. And what is happening with Web3 is very much a cultural movement, a community movement. And I do think it is the moment a lot of more culturally forward brands, more open source brands have been looking for. So why is Gucci doing a good job? I think the answer to why Gucci is doing a good job with this, because they've always been very culture first. They've always been very communal, always in conversation with their customers. And so, I think when you think about DAOs, like, what is a marketplace if you just reduce it? It's a two-sided platform. It connects brands and consumers, and the brands take on some capacity of the fulfillment themselves. Maybe not the fulfillment, they take on some capacity of the operation themselves. That's it. Marketplaces have existed since the beginning of commerce. They existed in ancient Uzbekistan. They existed on the Silk Road. When the Qing dynasty opened up China to the world, there was a bunch of marketplaces, 13 cannons. So if you think about the application of DAOs, we've been exploring a lot of, I think, intriguing early stage thoughts with some of the brands we work with. Things like, well, what would it look like to have a DAO where you could bring consumers into the product development process with your designers, and they could vote on what things could make it to market, and they could actually take a stake in that. And then they could receive some of the monetary rewards of that. Now you say that out loud, and like every CFO in the world is in therapy, and it's just like they're losing their mind. But and they probably should. To be fair, all the CFOs should be freaked out. But that model, like that's actually kind of a marketplace model. That's kind of like a staked marketplace model. And I think what we're seeing, and of course in Web3, there's a lot of stuff to roll your eyes at. There's like, because in everything new, there's a lot of stuff to roll your eyes at. And they're sort of like, oh, you're going to get a shoe, and I'm going to give you like a little NFT version of that shoe as a gift with purchase. And it's going to be an extra $15 upcharge. Like that is very much like stage one incrementalism thinking. But when you start to see things like Bored Ape Yacht Club, or you start to see these creators who come into the space, they don't come with like a virtual as an add-on mindset. They come with a virtual native mindset. And the way that you saw digitally native vertical brands come in with a digital native mindset, as opposed to everybody who's just sort of like bolting on e-com as an afterthought. And so I would be lying if I said I knew what I thought the application of this emerging technology looked like to these business models, and to like these moments of staking and cultural engagement and cultural, like actually attaching value to your engagement with a brand, because we see it in trust. We see it in Edelman reports. We see it in research we do. People in some cases trust brands more than they trust their governments. They might trust brands with their data before they trust their doctors. And whatever you may think of that could be terrifying, but as a brand, you actually have, I hesitate to say a moral responsibility, but I think it probably is a moral responsibility to think about how do you more intentionally engage your communities, and how do you build that brand trust and salience? Because if you don't, I think you are going to be rightfully left behind.
Yeah, absolutely. That Edelman research, just mind-blowing, but absolutely makes sense that in times of uncertainty, people turn to the brands that they feel the strongest pull to, that align with their values, that, you know, align with them culturally. It's hugely key. I can't believe it. It's flown by, but we are literally at our last question. I want to thank you both so much for all of your insights. I've learned so much, but I'd like to end on just a nice agnostic, positive note, which is really ultimately about what excites you. You both work in this space. There's so much innovation. You know, we've covered so much over the last 45 minutes. What excites you for the future of marketplaces and this model over the medium term? Perhaps Steve, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, the opportunities are kind of limitless with a marketplace model. I think what excites me most, and some of it is Depop specific, but some can be applied, I think, to other marketplaces, is seeing the ways in which young entrepreneurs in particular can kind of tap in at a larger scale to the potential, whether it's to build a following, to build a business that exists in the marketplaces, or to, you know, raise capital and then do whatever they want to do with it. That's always exciting. I think from a more industry-facing perspective, I'm very excited about this sort of traceability of product as it moves through a circular or secondhand first network, and seeing it's really hard to do at the moment to sort of understand the journey that a piece of clothing has taken unless it goes direct from brand to consumer to the next consumer. So whether that's blockchain-like technology, whatever that looks like, I think that's something that's really powerful to understanding the environmental impact, but also just the journey that a piece of clothing can take. And I think, like, from a sort of challenge to the industry perspective, I would love to see marketplace models really become integrated in the distribution model that individual brands have, in a way that is sustained and not just kind of, you know, superficial.
Holden, what about you?
I mean, from a macro perspective, outside of marketplaces, the sort of like hockey stick acceptance of the circular economy has been wonderful to see. It's been wonderful to see platforms like Depop come to the market. I sit on the advisory board of the Buy Nothing groups, those Facebook groups, which are very much about like the giving economy. It's been interesting to see what that leadership team is doing to try and build their own community around it. So I have some hope. I have some hope that comes up with the circular economy. I'm loving the shift towards what I would call experiential loyalty, away from just like transactional points-based loyalty. Like you get 5 points, you get a free thing of guacamole or whatever at Chipotle. So things around events and services and unique ways to engage. And, you know, you look at the activation that Adidas did into the metaverse. Well, what was it built on top of? Well, it was built on top of a marketplace. It was built on top of OpenSea. But it's that promise of future value, of future engagement, of future just sort of things that go beyond, I'm traditionally selling you a shoe. And I think that evolution of brands is kind of like these living entities, and seeing real business model innovation beyond the borders of like your traditional product catalog. In 20 years, you know, what kind of brand is Lululemon going to be with their investments in connected hardware and in fitness classes and community? I don't know. I don't know if they're going to be known for their leggings, you know, inside of marketplaces. And this is some of the reason why we did this research and why we're launching some of the offerings we're doing, helping brands reframe the sort of commerce convergence space, and really, this is a consulting word, so you excuse me, kind of harmonize marketing and commerce-based thinking. So like bridging that divide and like reframing holistically, look, When you choose a marketplace historically, you've chosen it, one, based on the GMV it can drive, and two, based on the margin. And that's been the priority order. When you've thought about a marketing channel, you've thought about like mind share and awareness, and then ROAS as a secondary factor. You have to smoosh that thinking together. Smoosh is the best term I can use. You have to be more holistic and strategic. You have to be honest about your capabilities. Like, look, it's very hard to be successful on Tmall and Amazon. It's like you just throw it up and it works. You have to do bid optimization and performance reviews and feed all of this product content. Tools like Feedonomics enable that. Shopify is investing in that. So when we finally reach this point, when everybody says, the entire internet is a marketplace, that is what I am excited to happen. I think that's going to happen in the midterm. And I think that's when we're going to see brands do really, really interesting things and engage in really, really novel ways that we can't even predict today.
I think that sense of unpredictability is a really great note to end on. I feel like we need to have this conversation again, maybe even in 6 months, to see what's changed. There's just so much innovation happening right across the value chain. I just want to thank you both so much for all of your insights and expertise. I've certainly learned so much, so I'm sure that the BOF community has too. Just a heads up that if you've missed any part of today's session, it's available to watch immediately now on YouTube. And we'll also have a write-up of just all the key insights and themes and key action points live very soon on the BOF site too. And finally, I just want to say a big thanks to the BOF events team, to Charles and Neve, for all their great work behind the scenes, which makes this so slick and easy and possible. Thank you both, Holden and Steve. I'll see you soon, and we'll welcome you back to BOF Live soon, I'm sure.